大家好，歡迎大家嚟到言論自由行。Welcome to Solution on Wheels。大家都知道咧，而家國際藝術節喺度如火如荼進行緊啦。咁所以我哋今日亦都有一個特別嘅節目咧，就揾到兩位重量級、國際級嘅嘉賓嚟到。佢哋咧就由美國嚟到香港。我今日身處喺呢度咧，其實就係何鴻毅家族基金嘅辦公室嚟嘅。喺20樓咧，我哋旁邊有兩位嘉賓。分別有湯偉峰 Dr. Thomas Berghuis 同埋咧呢個古根漢或者古根海姆博物館啦，大家都好熟悉㗎啦，就係 Guggenheim。Guggenheim Museum 嘅 Alexandra Munroe 亦都係佢哋嘅 Curator 啦，亦都嚟到嘅。Welcome to Hong Kong.
Thank you very much.
So why are we interviewing these two important people and why are they in Hong Kong? 因為咧佢哋今日咧就要講一個好重要嘅題目，就係呢個藝術嘅發展，特別係當代中國藝術嘅發展。我哋不如先問咗Dr. Thomas Berghuis 啦，因為湯偉峰咧就係將會係古根漢嘅藝術館 Selected Curator for the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation Curator for Chinese Art. Am I saying it correctly?
Absolutely perfect.
OK。不如Thomas， 我哋開始傾偈啦，開始做訪問啦，好嘛？
黃先生啊，唔好意思啊，我廣東話識懂唔識講啊，會說國語啊。
OK, all right。
英文也可以啊。
OK。Well, first of all, I think I want to emphasize on the name or the new title.The selected curator for the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation Curator for Chinese Art. Is it a new position, Alexandra?
Yes, it's a new position that comes out of the Asian Art Initiative at the Guggenheim Museum that was established in 2006 as one of many global art initiatives that the Guggenheim has undertaken over recent years. China, Greater China, has been central to our strategy, to our mission, to our thinking about world art history. And we are so pleased that Thomas will be joining the team in the summer as our first dedicated curator to Chinese contemporary art.
All right. I think it's a very obvious question, but everybody knows that contemporary Chinese art is booming. But why do you need a focus position to work on that in Guggenheim? What's the thinking behind?
We are looking at world art history. We are looking at the Guggenheim Museum in a wider global context. We are trying to introduce new perspectives, new histories of modernism, new ideas of global art practice into the body, into the DNA of the Guggenheim Museum. China is an essential part of world creativity today. It is an essential culture and discourse for us to understand, or at least attempt to understand. There's no way that we can be an encyclopedic presentation. There's no way that we want to present a monolithic idea of what China is or where China is going, but we want to be part of the conversation. We want to be part of helping Americans and the world understand China in a global context.
So, over to the selected curator. How did you get interested for this new position? And what is your hopes and perhaps fears in landing to this new position?
Fear is always time. You know how much time you have. I like to take time, and I think indeed a special engagement with China, and especially Greater China, needs a lot of time. The interesting thing about this position is that it takes its time. It is a 5-year contract that I'll be working on, so I'll be embedded in the Guggenheim institution and in the team. So with that in mind, I can take time to actually contemplate what we've just discussed, is not only Chinese art, but there are also, of course, considerations that not only we have in New York, and we will have in New York, but also in Greater China. on what is China, why China is so big at this moment. So we have to ask a lot of questions, and my curatorial work is, say, different from just exhibition making, in which I select works that are in artist studios or that I see at an art fair. My curatorial process is very important. So for me, it was a very interesting step, moving from an academic world as well into a museum world. My curatorial practice has always been independent, as I called it. But I felt immediately, last year I met Alexandra and an education team and a critical group that we had from South and Southeast Asia. I met in Bangkok, and here is an institution who is very much focused on education as well, which I absolutely adore, and that is my passion. It is also giving this position very much an independent role for a curator to commission works, to work in depth with artists, to extend that into not only making an exhibition, but as I said from the beginning, I want this project to breathe into the institution. So to breathe into the Guggenheim means that the process over the next 5 years is a continuous process. The exhibitions will be there in a particular time frame, but the actual process, the curatorial process as well, the process of discussing issues with artists, curators, colleagues here in Hong Kong, in Macau, in Taiwan, in mainland China, that is an integral part of how I work, and that is an integral part of the commission that will finally come from this. We will see an exhibition, but we're also, planning to have a whole bunch of material on the actual process, and I'm very happy to sort of speak about it as I'm doing now. Yeah.
It's interesting you use a metaphor, you breathe into Guggenheim, right? But you also mentioned in the beginning that timing is of the utmost importance. So can you catch your breath? I mean, if you want to breathe into the museum, how are you going to do it? You're doing it like here and there and everywhere? Because China is so big. I mean, how can you go to everywhere and breathe into Guggenheim?
There are Chinese ways of thinking about this and broader Asian ways of thinking. It's a couple of deep belly breaths. Usually calms you down a bit. But here, of course, the pace with which this region is changing and the pace with which China is changing as a concept as well, that is something, of course, a lot of people feel out of breath. I can see where you're pointing that out, because a lot of people, this pace with which change is happening, especially economic change, is happening, almost makes you out of breath. I think that's why I'm saying that for me, one of the biggest worries, of course, is time. So we have this 5-year program, but by actually taking these deep belly breaths, when I'm in communication with artists, with curators, when we get moments to actually sit down and really talk over time, like I take my time. I usually spend about 6 hours with an artist or longer, and we meet over time as well.
Oh, we can do 6 hours.
Yeah, we can. We were just talking about it. I like my lectures to be 3 hours as well. But really, by doing that, we can consider a different pace. And hopefully, because for me it is important that art generates social change, that will transcend into society. We've considered the avant-garde throughout the 20th century as something that society and politics change art, and we know as well in China there are artists responding to politics, but there are also many artists, also here in Hong Kong and in Macau, who you can see making a contribution to actual social change, and through citizens and communities to consider what contemporary culture means. So that is something that I will focus on. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm so moved by what Thomas is saying, because it reminds me of the founding mission of the Guggenheim Museum. We were founded in 1937 as the Museum of Non-Objective Art, around a collection of the Russian abstract artist Vasily Kandinsky, who in 1912 wrote a manifesto on abstract art as the foundation of a new spirituality, and that new spirituality would affect social change and would be part of a larger revolution of modernity itself in the 20th century universally. And I think it's very interesting that we are still informed by that dictate. We still, as curators at the Guggenheim Museum, still believe in the power of art, indeed in the mandate of art, to affect individual by individual, a pause, a moment of contemplation, reflection, and social change.
It's actually quite fascinating when you consider that the manifesto has been pronounced 100 years ago, and consider the social change we have seen around the world for the past century is extremely fascinating. And back then, we don't even call it Russia, right? We call it USSR. I mean,
Before USSR.
oh yes, that's right. Even before USSR. So back then, we call it Russia, and then it became USSR, and then we call it back to Russia.
But
That's
Kandinsky
right.
left as soon as trouble hit and moved to Munich and to Paris.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned timing, pacing, social change, but I really want to ask what Alexandra has mentioned earlier. It sounds like an oxymoron to me. The history of modern contemporary. So you put history, contemporary, and modern together at the same time. So you want to reshape that. You said Guggenheim wants to reshape that. What does it really mean? I mean, how to reshape
I think it's a broader question than just the Guggenheim. I think one of the questions we ask, of course, and I must say, a lot of contemporary curators or a lot of contemporary thinkers in the art world, even museums, including new private museums, what they're considering the contemporary to be is as if it just dropped out of the sky. And they're looking for that moment that it dropped out of the sky. So there's a kind of global contemporary art movement that says, oh, it dropped out of the sky in the late 80s somewhere. Or maybe in 1990, where sort of economic progression happened in China as well. It was Deng Xiaoping's southern tour. But what we want to understand, of course, is how, and yesterday I was talking to artists about this as well, how change, also in Hong Kong and also in Macau, is still affected by modernity. Not the modern, but modernity. Modernity as a cultural modernity as well. There was a contact at a particular moment in time in the mid-19th century in which the contact occurred between a West that considered the East other. But the important thing, of course, is there's a double othering there as well. So the East, or in this case, individual countries and nations and new nations as well, considered the West as something other. And in a very specific form as well. So as China was considered other, Chinese intellectuals and Chinese artists were considered this term Omei. And Omei literally was Europe and America together. So there was this kind of othering, this double othering. But what happened in the process of modernity, of course, is a particular kind of change. A change that affected the way that this transformation, and essentially new influences started to emerge. So from that contact onwards, we know that there is the development of modern art in Japan, the development of modern art in China, a lot of contemporary art. And here we're going back, for example, in China in the 1980s, even the 1970s. We know of an exhibition in 1989 in February at the China Art Gallery, and in English it is called China Avant-Garde. It needed that avant-garde term in order to make sense of a new movement. It was a new wave movement as well. In Chinese, it was translated into English. It was the Great Modern Art Exhibition. It was the follow-up of a modern art movement that was there in the 1920s and 30s. This, of course, is something that long-term institutions like the Guggenheim have also considered. I think what the real, true value is of the Guggenheim, and we will explore that further as well, because I'm very interested in exploring certain aspects of the collection, is that very early on, in that moment, it was also already thinking about the world. Yeah. It wasn't thinking about Manhattan. or New York, which can be kind of a closed off kind of, an environment, like we have them elsewhere as well. There are certain European cities that sometimes, but in that environment, indeed, the founding of this collection, the founding of the museum, was done with a world perspective. So, I think what Alexandra is also saying is that although the Guggenheim, also to the outside world, is showing this new change in terms of, the position of an Asian art curator, now a Chinese art curator, that we have to understand this global change that the Guggenheim is also, profiling internationally, that this change is actually part of its history. How important to have that, to consider new museums that are built in Asia. I know that M+ considers itself and its contemporaneity in regards to the modern. It is collecting, at a broad scale. It is building up an institution for the region. It is also profiling itself as an Asian art museum, but also as a museum within China and also within Hong Kong. So these institutions, and the people that work there, they will agree with us. Yeah.
Okay. So you always have the world in mind, and you always think in terms of history, the development of history.
I think one of the issues that we see as we look out on, younger Chinese curators today is sometimes a miscalculation of what it is to be a curator. And one big reason I selected Thomas, why the institution selected Thomas for this very important position, is because we really admired his work as a historian. And curating is a process of intellectual research, and it is based on scholarship, and it is dedicated to education, and it is about connecting to a public. And so those powers of education that Thomas has in his past as an academic also appeal to us enormously. But if you look at the history of the curators who have worked at the Guggenheim Museum, at our museum directors who have served the Guggenheim Museum, we're all deeply engaged in the process of mapping history, and now increasingly mapping alternative histories, understanding that history is not at all a single lineage, not at all a single line, even for the Guggenheim, but also recognizing that every institution has its own inflection. Every institution has its own site, has its own personality, is made up of a collection of scholars and curators who are seeing the world through a particular lens, who were driven by particular curiosities and questions about the world that they have been formed, that have formed them through their own education and their own lives. And I think what we're saying about the Guggenheim, we're not setting out to change the world. We're not setting out to reshape history. But we are committed as an institution, and we're committed as individuals working within that institution to a cultural conversation. And that cultural conversation about the purpose of art is widening in radical ways. And for an institution in the 21st century in the West to stay relevant, you have to be engaged in that conversation. You have to be connected. And that brings us back to the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation. A very significant part of this initiative and of other initiatives that are underway at the Guggenheim is the idea of a network. We're not focusing this research and this exhibition making and this commissioning process and ultimate collection solely within the confines of the Guggenheim as it resides in New York. We are seeing this as a very live, active, even online platform where a dynamic and multi-directional relationship with our colleagues around Greater China and certainly based here in Hong Kong is central to the work that we're going to be doing.
So indeed, history is live. History is now as well.
Yeah, but
It's an important consideration for, of course, links to Buddhism and Taoism. You almost want to say have a watch that says it's now, because we have to understand as well how the past presents itself and lives in the present. So that is important.
Yeah, the concept of 当下。
就是。
当下。But it's also very inspiring when you mention just that. I mean, right now you can actually see the parallel universe in the world, in one world actually. And I think instead of reshaping it, you are actually documenting it and see how it transform into a different.
Interpreting it.
Yeah, and interpreting.
I mean, documentation is extremely important, and that's where scholarship and rigor and training come in, and historical perspective. But I think we're equally engaged, in a great institution and a great curator is also marked by interpretation.
But can I ask you slightly more about the Robert H. Ho Foundation's work with Guggenheim? Particularly on how you are going to commission some work, right? And can you tell me more about that? How you're going to travel to different parallel universe with the foundation?
Just a little bit of history, and then I'll let Thomas answer that question. Though I have to say, we're absolutely at the beginning of this. Thomas has not even moved to New York yet. He is a global citizen, and he's very peripatetic, but he has yet to move to New York. So all of this is
right now he's here.
very early in our thinking. But I will say that the Guggenheim's relationship to the Robert H. Ho Family Foundation goes back to 2008, when they funded, was the lead funder of our retrospective of the Chinese artist Cai Guoqiang, and the Guggenheim presented a major exhibition that actually traveled to Beijing and traveled to Guggenheim Bilbao in 2008 and 9. And they also came in as sponsors of a very important exhibition that I organized in 2009, looking at the influence of Asian art and thought, particularly Buddhist aesthetics, on the history of modern art in America. And because of the Ho Foundation's interest first in Chinese art, they were very excited to participate with us on the presentation of Tsai's show. And because of their interest in Buddhist art, they were very interested in seeing how American artists reinterpreted, misinterpreted, used, misused to their own creative radical effect, ideas that were derived from their encounter with Asia, through objects, through books, through readings, through text, through poetry, through their own experiences as Buddhist practitioners in America. And through those two very successful sponsorships, we began to discuss how this could grow into a longer-term partnership. And if I can speak a little bit on behalf of the Ho Foundation, I think they realized the power of contemporary art as a gateway into an understanding of Chinese art, Chinese history, Chinese philosophy. And so many of the artists who we are interested in working with, and so much of what is going on in China today, is a critical new interpretation of China's own past, of its own DNA, if you will, of its own philosophical coordinates, and how art can serve as a threshold to reimagine those philosophical coordinates to a new contemporary language.
Thomas, how do you see your new role, and how do you map up your new plan?
Well, I think, first of all, to follow on the Robert H. Ho Family Foundation, I think what the foundation is doing at its core is to bring something really valuable to the table. I've met Robert Y.C. Ho 2 days ago over dinner, and we got talking. And of course, I talk as a scholar as well. And Robert was very appreciative of it. But then I said, you know, what you offer in this project as a foundation is this truth and this value, also by a philanthropic gesture. You know, here is a well-established family from Hong Kong with a lot of history as well, bringing together a foundation that sponsors this project, as we just heard, Cai Guoqiang, but also does a lot of projects here in Hong Kong, especially in education and also in arts and creativity. So I think that is really where I see the value as well. In terms of, I keep on thinking about these parallel sort of universes that you mentioned, and I just recall this morning I was reading yesterday's Financial Times newspaper. There's a big spread article on a colleague of mine from Japan, Yuko Hasegawa, who writes about her sort of phrase now is horizontal. She likes to see these horizontal structures. But I'm thinking as well in parallel universes or horizontal structures, the thing that we still have to consider is that we're looking at horizons. And these horizons are both curved as well. And these horizons also make us to move. So even though you want to see this kind of horizontal, I'm now looking outside and I see, the mountains here. You still have to travel. You also have to know what is behind that mountain. So you have to change your horizons. My curatorial practice will be based on that. Before I came to Hong Kong and before the art fair started, I spent a few days in Macau. And of course, the question here was, what were you doing in Macau? In Macau, I met a very good friend of mine, Feng Chao, who is both a curator at the Macau Art Museum, but also founded a very interesting contemporary art space, Niufang, Ox Warehouse. And we spent days walking through Macau, both looking at the city landscape and at the communities there and the citizens of Macau, talking about its history, talking about its environment, and then meeting a lot of artists and going through art spaces. So that is the type of process that I'm taking. Yesterday, after the art fair, halfway during the day, I went to Kowloon. I went to JCCAC to meet Mok Chu-yu and Yuan Jie, who are two very important people in terms of community development and creative industries as well. And they do from theater to dance to visual art. They also represent a fantastic network with countries. One of their projects is now traveling to Ghana after it's traveling to Bangladesh. So we can also learn from these kind of, more, which we consider more grassroots organizations about what their horizons are, what their networks are. So I will always take them into my curatorial process as well.
I mention or I use parallel universe to describe how history can go into various routes, alternative history, as Alexandra has just said. And this is particularly important to China, especially modern China. I mean, a country with such a long history and also such a long future ahead as well with the world together. As a curator, as a scholar, as a historian, how are you going to describe modern China? I mean, not in 6 hours, but how are you going to describe modern China in a few sentences, Thomas?
Visually and conceptually, the biggest challenge for me to see was the Olympic ceremony in 2008. Because here was a China that presented itself through what we know as a centralized government structure as well, that is positioning China in relation to the world. It was very beautiful. The BBC commentary constantly says, China, 5,000 years of history. This is beautiful. Oh, you know that it's complex. You also know that China has something 多样化. You also know that China is not only centralized Beijing China, it has a multicultural diversity as well. So ever since that moment, ever since that, for many people, beautiful moment, I started to have my concerns with other sinologists as well. Jeremy Barmay at the Australian National University representing China in the World Centre. I'll be an associate with them as well when I carry this position. Is this concern terms like 和谐中国? This prosperous China, this type of China looking for a new golden age, this China extending that new golden age as well into other areas that it considers to be part of one China, which was another slogan during the Olympics. I think it will be very important for culture and through culture and through art to investigate the cultural diversity, and in that diversity find something common. But this is common to people. You know, this really brings it back to the basis. It really brings it back to the people rather than to a centralized government. And I know there's a wonderful book out now as well, 和谐中国, which has been translated as The Fat Years in English. And it, of course, one cannot read it in China, but I hear it's been circulating. And it's a very important consideration.
Yeah, but if I try to summarize what you have just said, is that no, it's all right. We have seen a prosperous China, but we also have high hopes to the China ahead as well.
We've seen a hard currency prosperous China. Now we want to see the software. You know, we've seen the hardware. Now we want to see the software, which comes from the people. Right. Yeah, this is a system. Yeah.
Yeah, but it always comes to me that whenever you're trying to interact with people, or if you're trying to interact with a people who is changing, who is growing, there will be dilemmas, there will be arguments, especially when you are talking about in the history of time. You mentioned avant-garde earlier as a translation. I mean, people sometimes will define China using the West perspective. I mean, defining the East with the West. So East is not West, or the other way around, On curation, I mean, how are you going to bring your curation skills, experience into China, whereas China may have their own views about what curation is about?
It was
respond to that?
because it was listed in the mandate actually as well. Right.
Well, we're not creating an institute of China at the Guggenheim Museum. We are the Guggenheim Museum. We are devoted to modern and contemporary art. And in spite of a long history of internationalism, we still are an institution that is very much shaped by a European and American worldview. And I think it's very important as we talk and as we consider your fabulous questions, Vincent, to remember the context where all of this is going to happen. And it's the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And we're not after, I guess I said earlier, a kind of monolithic response to the future of China. We are after a conversation with that question. We want to be part of the questioning process and come back and not pose answers, but if our work is useful, we will be posing more questions. And I want to make it very clear, those questions should not be focused only at China. Those questions need to be focused back at our own institution and back at our own history of European and American art and back at our own initiatives of global art that are now engaged with the Middle East and with Latin America and with other forms of new histories. So I think we're modest. Our project is modest. It's very serious, but I want to emphasize its modesty. And we're approaching this with profound respect for the amazing amount of work that is already being done in China. And we're eager to participate with those individuals and those curators and those artists and those centers and those official and unofficial places that are conducting research and bringing this research to the people.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that as well. This is as much an exhibition about New York as I travel to. Yeah, a project, 3 exhibitions. Yeah, I know. Okay, I will work hard. Yeah, but also a project which is as much about New York. And to quote the title of a sort of the first book which one reads about New York, about early New York as well. New York has always been an island at the center of the world, but that world has now changed. Curatorial thinking has also followed up from what people expect here in the region. We're not mapping. We're not like cartographers, like we used to have Europeans come to Asia and sort of draw lines. Interpersonal contact. that is what this region has always thrived on, from those early days as well. We know that there's a centralized China, but we also know that the south of China was trading with Indonesia and was trading with Southeast Asia. So this always relied on interpersonal contact. The world did at that time. This is maybe also what we find in a contemporary type of environment, It's no longer about consensus. It is actually about disagreeing as well, dissensus. But through that disagreement, and as we were just saying as well, you said yourself, I don't always have the answers. You have the answers. We don't always have the answers, but together we can work on solutions, answers. We can at least make change.
And pose new questions.
And pose new questions. Of course, please.
And the questions.
Well.
And the questions are not only to others, but also to ourselves.
Yes.
I think that's very important too.
Very key.
Yeah. So we talk about history, and then culture, and then the work, the country. How about we talk about the people? I mean, you have seen a lot of Chinese people. I mean, how are you going to describe Chinese? Not the language, but the people.
I think it's both asking, indeed, as I mentioned before, to get this multicultural dimension of China back out. But it's not only asking about the Chinese, it is also asking these days about China. And asking about China, and this is an important consideration that I've had over, say 2 years now, is also since that Olympic moment. Also since hearing the BBC commentators sort of reflect on this 5,000-year history, but asking ourselves, what is the China within us? And that is for each citizen around the globe is now a question. China is no longer out there. You just have to open the newspaper or, switch on your radio or anywhere you can find your China. But we have to discover what that China is. And of course, we have to bring that question back to China and say, how does China consider the globe? How does the globe consider China? And the globe is, of course, a bit of a tricky term, but we can also say the world, or we can say each one of us. So we have to consider that each individually and as a collective.
But you also mentioned
what is China and why China?
And I think that is a big aspect of this project, Vincent, and it's something that the Guggenheim, being situated in New York, but activated by expertise as Thomas is bringing and as others on the team are bringing and will bring, we can be that distance, that critical distance to the question of what is China in the world, what is China in the globe today and in the future. That is a question that is really becoming central to this project with the Ho Family Foundation, and I think is something special, possibly even unique, that the Guggenheim in its conversations can bring to the table.
But Thomas also mentioned that a lot of his work will be about interacting with people.
Yes.
How do you see, or how would you describe those interactions? I mean, you speak to them in Mandarin or Putonghua or Cantonese, or obviously not Cantonese, right?
For the moment, I speak to them in Mandarin, in Putonghua or Guoyu. I can also still read Fantizi apart from Jiantizi. So, I can also respond to, say, things that are written in Hong Kong. Although I sometimes need, people to help me. So that is, again, that dialogue that needs to happen also to help me. Cantonese, I said at the beginning, was sek dong, sek dang. But
How do you feel about interacting with them?
I feel most of the time, when one interacts with people, it may be different when one interacts, say, for the media. But when one interacts with people in, say, a more close group environment, or, yesterday as well, we were standing on the street and talking to a few artists, you can have a lot of sense as well. So you also sense where people are directing their thoughts and where I'm directing my thoughts. And through that process, you're learning. It is really that interpersonal interaction, but also talking about the past into the present. So you talk about these different time dimensions. Scientifically, we now know that time no longer exists, you know? So we're actually in and out of time all the time. But I think that is through those awarenesses as well of how we then communicate. We can learn of each other. I'm Dr. Thomas J. Berghuis. You know, I'm supposed to be a teacher, but I think these days teachers is much different than, say, 我教你, you know, I teach you, I educate you, I tell you what you need to know. In my teaching in Sydney as well, I was interacting with my students. We, had problems and solutions through each other's engagement, through having that space, which also was a challenge when young people start to demand that space to be online, to be on the internet, to be so-called interactive, but it's actually not that physical sense of being present in the same room or things can happen. So I think that is where travel again comes in. I could be sitting somewhere else and just communicate by Skype and Facebook, but that is not what we do.
I also just want to put this in the context of the Guggenheim's already long-standing engagement with China, going back most spectacularly, let's say, to 1998 when the Guggenheim presented an exhibition called China 5,000 Years. Maybe that's where BBC got their idea. And in those days, we were doing rather spectacular historic shows, but that show also had a very important chapter on the 20th century Chinese art called The Century in Crisis that was guest curated by Julia Andrews and Xu Yikun, who are wonderful scholars who, of course, now have a show at Asia Study Hong Kong on the early decade of contemporary Chinese art. And we've had also a series of Hugo Boss Prize initiatives going back to 1998, and several contemporary Chinese artists have been nominated to the Hugo Boss, including in the first class, Tsai Guotang, Huang Yongping, Chao Fei. There have been many Chinese artists and thinkers who are also part of our Asian Art Council, which is a curatorial think tank that I established in 2006. Xu Bing is a member of that. Fan Dian has been a member of that. Pang Gongkai has been a member of that at CAFA. Ning is a member of that. A number of, just thinking of younger artists and younger thinkers have been very active. Gao Shiming at Hangzhou, Wu Heng at University of Chicago. Johnson Chang has been a great helper to us. Here in Hong Kong, the Asian Art Archive, Jane Debevoise and Claire Xu are also members of our Asian Art Council. So we have already developed a kind of infrastructure, a living infrastructure for what you're calling, Vincent, interpersonal contact. We thrive on it. Our research is based on that. Both institutional connections that we have generated, also exhibition platforms that have already been underway with Hugo Boss Prize, with the Tsai Guotang exhibition. We also had Techin Xie, Taiwanese artist based in New York, was central to the exhibition Third Mind, American Artists Contemplate Asia. So we've already been very active even, and certainly hospitable, and certainly engaged with many of these questions. And the Ho Family Foundation initiative builds on that and will deepen our ties and deepen our participation in the conversation. But that culture of interpersonal connection exists already.
I think going to the final part of this interview, a few ideas pop up, especially when Thomas just mentioned that a lot of students nowadays demand the creative space in the technology world, in the virtual world, online. I mean, and definitely our future will be intertwined with technology, and art will live together with technology. I mean, can you have a few words to share on China, technology, modern art?
I think one of the things that we have to consider is the relationship with art and media, and how those paradigms are shifting. Indeed. Between us, of course. also artists, and then one can think about artists using new media. But it's also artists actually responding to media. We know this dimension of a few artists, one in particular, Ai Weiwei, is often discussed. Although Ai Weiwei is often discussed in terms of its him being a dissident, speaking out on the media. But what we have to realize as well is that Ai Weiwei has been an artist who is integrating his work with media. Not only digital media, but also reforming new forms. He's also using traditional, say, ceramics to change that medium and change that media. A lot of artists are doing this day. I think what a lot of young people who are in the online space need to understand, we are dealing with that online space and everything is considered there, but at the same time they should also go back to outside and actually consider the medium there, which could be brick, or could be street pavement, or could be the forms that they see in the city, or could be talking to their neighbor.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned M+ earlier. You'll be working very closely with the Robert H. Ho Foundation, and we're in Hong Kong. 当下 we are in Hong Kong. How do you see Hong Kong as a media? Hong Kong as a media to China, Hong Kong as a media to modern and contemporary art? Yeah.
I'll jump in for a second. I certainly think you're asking that question at an amazing moment in the history. Back to time. Certainly the Art Basel Hong Kong has been transformative for Hong Kong, but also for the region and really for the world. But the success of Art Basel Hong Kong depends on an infrastructure, it depends on an energy that is already very present in Hong Kong. And even though M+ does not yet have a building, its activities, the hires that it has made were wonderful curators like Pi Li and Pauline Yao and Tobias Berger. Its acquisitions of fabulous collections, the Uli Sig collection, and the announcement of the incredible one-year projects by Texin Xie. These are already sending waves into the universe. The work of Hong Kong University, the work of the Asia Study Hong Kong Center, which is such an extraordinary venue architecturally and promises to bring so much power as a convening center, international convening center to Hong Kong. And I think the work of people like Tom, like Johnson Chang, who has been working on this for 30 years, making Hong Kong a hospitable, nurturing environment for artists, for thought, for creativity, through his exhibitions, through his work that he's done as both a curator and a dealer. So you have a lot happening here that is coming to a certain kind of fruition. It's a certain culminating moment. And that culminating moment is truly historic and I think will be ever more transformative. And the Robert H. Ho Family Foundation is part of that. Yeah. It really is this amazing constellation of events. And we're so excited to be part of that too. And I think we already are.
And my question to you would be whether Hong Kong can also remediate. By remediating is also actually, moving back the remediation of certain media, of the complexity of media back into Hong Kong as well, and transcend that back into the world. There's a big discussion now in terms of Chinese art historians, scholars, both in China and in the West, about the value of ink and brush painting as a kind of contemporaneity of China and Chinese art. But it's also, of course, trying to find its own classics. It's trying to canonize. I think Johnson Chang is a very good example of the complexities of remediation in China. Johnson, with his Jinshui project, in which he actually investigates folk art, is, I think, a far more complex project than just looking for Guohua as a kind of proto-nationalist type of Chinese practice, which we know that actually transcended across East Asia and probably even further into Southeast Asia. So indeed, let's remediate through Art Basel as well, is the complexities of this history. Yesterday I was with a couple of galleries, and I know that a couple of, say, oil painters who were also doing ink and brush painting are now also considering folk art traditions. The complexity of material there as well.
So you by remediation, you mean instead of always looking ahead into the future of China, it might be beneficial for us to look back.
That's right.
And then look at our tradition and see how we bring it to Hong Kong and then bring it forward to the future.
Thing as well is this thing. When I teach my class, people think of this as a smartphone. I say, why don't you consider this as a cabinet of curiosity, like the old German Wunderkammer? That if you have your engagement with the museum on this, and the Guggenheim is also very much in the online space, then this becomes your Wunderkammer. This becomes the thing. And it's actually designed in the same way with all these apps that are like little closets that you open. So that is also a form of remediation, that we think about new technologies and new ways of interacting, actually how that would have related to our past as well, and to discovery.
Wunderbar. I think last but not least, there are 7 million people who live in Hong Kong. We all know that Art Basel is crowded with people, but there are still people who wants to trying to learn more about contemporary art, trying to understand more about modern China through art, but they still hesitate. They don't understand how. As a beginner, if they want to begin on that journey, not to be a curator, but if we want to help them, assist them to appreciate contemporary art, is there any solution to them?
Open up the public space to art and creativity. Like I said yesterday, yes, I visited Art Basel. I saw general audiences going in as well, through a paid ticketing system. But indeed, they engage there. There's also a particular glitterati and glamour around it. So I think in my own mind, I needed to go to JCCAC. I needed to go to Kowloon. I needed to take the MTR. I needed to be with the people. And I needed to be with an organization that is both about art, about creative industry, about culture, and that is also a space that is opening up a lot for the community, and also for the community and kind of back through the art school as well. That is where a real value needs and a real investment needs to be taken place. Art schools may be these days under challenge because of the market and because of sort of, we had a workshop session with Art Basel as well. And there were collectors there were curators, there were critical thinkers, museum people. There was nobody from arts education. And that actually would have been very important for them to actually have realized, bring in people from arts education at the grassroots as well, community centers that deal with art too. So I think that is really important.
So you have to lure them in.
Yeah.
I'd like to say that I think Art Basel and Asia Art Archive have done a wonderful job in developing and presenting a series of lectures and workshops precisely to help educate and to help, maybe going back to the word fear, lessen the fear in approaching what contemporary art can be. And my two main answers to your question, Vincent, would be: one, any chance to talk to an artist, go hear an artist, ask an artist question, become familiar with the wonder and the challenges and the radicality of artists' minds. If you can fall in love with that mind, you will need to live with art. You will need to have it in your space, because it will constantly remind you to live in a certain way and think in a certain way and feel in a certain way. I also remember going many years ago to a event at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where we had the directors of the Met, the director of the Louvre, the director of the British Museum, and the director of the Hermitage all speaking. This was just at the cusp of the digital age. And they all came independently with a analysis that if a person does not enter a museum by the age of 18 years old, the likelihood that they ever will is close to zero. So my message to Hong Kong.
Of all these?
Yes.
Of all these
Yes.
they have consensus.
Yeah, complete independent consensus from all their metrics and all their analysis. Which brings me back again to the importance of education, to answer your question, Vincent, and the importance of family programs and the importance of getting kids into the art fair and getting kids into museums and making sure that artists are going to the elementary schools and the secondary schools and teaching art and making kids comfortable with making a mess and with using their hands and thinking in abstract ways. And this also, coming back to the Guggenheim, is absolutely central to our founding mission. And education is going to be an enormous component of the Ho Family Foundation initiative. And when we say education, we don't just mean a symposium of leading scholars talking to a room of peers. That's important. We also mean family programs. We also mean online programs. We also mean apps. We also mean play space. And this is really important. I think your question is essential, but it is not unique to Hong Kong. We still face that issue in New York. How do we educate people about art? Art of the past, art of the present, art from China, art from New York. It's the same question.
And also, back at the basics, it is about looking. So also, children's in musea. My father was an artist, so I went to the museum very early. I must have been 3 months old. My mom told me, and he brought me to all the museums in Amsterdam. But I also recall that he wasn't talking to me as an expert, even though he was, as an abstract expert. I do the same with my daughter, who is now 3 years old. I actually bring it to her level. But one thing and this is very easy to tell children as well, just to bring it back to something really basic, but something really important, is by looking, it's also no touching. So you also have children that sort of, but by looking, you also teach children to really interact with something through their eyes. So you explain what the rules are of the museum. You bring your child in there, you bring it to their level. You start talking about colors, you start talking about vision. As they grow up, you start talking about the complexity of the work. Please, people of Hong Kong, bring your children to these art places. Yeah.
Well, it's a very pleasant 1 hour, and I'm very glad Alexandra has brought us back to the beginning of my first question about fear, about time. I'm afraid we are about time to end this interview. But I find my solution today by interacting with you. I mean, human interaction is such an important element in arts, in culture. By interacting with curator, with people in the industry, we can fall in love with art easily. And once you let the artist breathe into your mind, and then you cannot live without art. I mean, that's possibly the solution to human history, I would say, because you cannot live your life without art, which means that you have to live a culture life. And I think a culture life means a lot to history development. I mean, that's key. So thank you very much, and I would strongly suggest all the parents, you bring your kids to an art museum before you take them to take the Hong Kong ID card. We took the Hong Kong ID card by the age of 18. So before you took the Hong Kong ID card, you must take them to an art museum and talk to them with stories, fascinate them with artists. I mean, that's the solution we have today. Well, thank you so much, Alexandra.
Thank you, Vincent.
And thank you very much, Thomas. I look forward to you come to Hong Kong again, and we'll have another 1 hour chat like this next time.
Fantastic.
Maybe in a mobile truck.
I look forward to it. Yeah.
Thank you so very much for allowing us this platform, and we look forward to welcoming all of you to New York to see the first of Thomas's 3 exhibitions, which will be commission-based, focused on contemporary Chinese art.
Well, thank you very much, and see you next time in an art museum. Bye.
Great. Thank you.